All right, what's up, people? It's your boy Jason Muse, aka the Black Muse. Welcome to the Black Muse podcast. I'm actually excited for a couple of reasons. One, this is the first episode of 2024.
All right, what's up, people?
Just wanted everybody to know that.
Uh-oh.
Hold on, we got a little technical difficulties.
I'm actually excited for a couple of reasons. One,
hold on, let me fix this real quick.
Of 2024. All right, what's up, people? Just wanted everybody to know that.
Let me capture that echo real quick.
I'm actually excited.
See what's going on here.
Just wanted everybody to know.
Oh, I see. Okay. I have found the problem. All right. Let me try it again. Welcome, everybody. This is Jason Muse, aka the Black Muse. Welcome to the Black Muse podcast. I'm going to put my theme music back up because I had to figure out what was going on. And I figured it out. There we go. Get it right. So, I am now doing something new that I haven't done before, and that was actually the source of the issue. I am now broadcasting on IG Live as we speak for the first time. StreamYard, which is the platform that I use, just enabled that, and I had my IG open on a different screen, so it was echoing, and I was hearing double the music, and I was like, "What is happening?" So that's what happened. That was a technical difficulty, but I solved it. I fixed it. Welcome to 2024. We just roll with the punches. Sometimes things happen and we don't quite expect them, but we just make the best out of them. But anyway, I'm really excited about today's episode because it is the first episode that I am recording in 2024. I went on a little bit of a hiatus. Life happened, got busy, but I'm really happy, first of all, to have the privilege to even be on this great earth another day. Definitely very happy to have the privilege to go into 2024. And actually, what I want to do is I want to start in honor of the best friend I ever had by the name of John Willie Osuji. My best friend passed away on Thanksgiving Day in 2023. And I've been missing him like crazy. And I've been kind of dealing with that personally. Just kind of going through the stages of grief, trying to accept the reality of that. But I'm reminded right now that I get the privilege to go into 2024. And unfortunately, he doesn't. And so I wanted to give a shout out to him. And I wanted to tell kind of the world or the everybody that's listening how much I love my dear friend John, how much I miss my dear friend John. And I think that his sudden passing, he's roughly the same age as me. I've known him since the 7th grade. Really put into perspective the value of each day that we get on this planet because we never know when our time is up. So shout out to my friend John, who will always be memorable to me. With that said, though, on a more positive note, I actually have a special guest here, somebody that, as with all my other guests, I met through Clubhouse, and he and I are kind of aligned kind of in our philosophy in terms of like how we approach discourse, how we approach intellectual exchange. And even when things get really hotly contested, even when things become really high stakes and emotions are high, and you have this side of your perspective and I'm on this side of that perspective and we're just clashing, how can we still manage, despite often really vast differences in worldviews, to manage to still come together and have a constructive dialogue about high stakes topics? So I'm excited to introduce to you all my friend who actually has his own podcast by the name of Scott Mitchell. Scott Mitchell, welcome to the Black Muse podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. What a powerful intro, Jason. I didn't know about that, but that's A, I'm sorry to hear that, but B, I think it's really important what you just said about gratitude, because I think that's the one thing that's crazy about life is that it is finite. No matter what we try to do, it's not permanent. And it's so easy, I think, to just fall asleep in that and think that you've always got more time, you've always got tomorrow, you've always got this, or you're always going to have the people you love, around you. And it's not always true. Like, it changes and it's not permanent. And once I think we realize the impermanence of that, I think it opens up a real opportunity to experience the sacred urgency of the present, like the ability to be grateful of the moments we do have. So that's a really powerful, I appreciate you sharing that, because that's inspiring to me too, but I'm sorry you had to go through that. But I think that's a beautiful way to honor your friend, is just to be aware of how precious the gift and the moments that you have now are, because that's something I think we all forget so easily, you know? But yeah, it's an honor to be here, man. And I always enjoy talking to you, because I think you are a very profound human being. And I really love the way that you can, you know, kind of parse things and think about things and try to bring people from different perspectives together. I think that's really important too. So anyway, it's an honor to be here.
And I appreciate that. And it's funny because we were talking off stage, and I was telling you how I like to just do things impromptu. And I think one of the beauties of that for me is I get ideas in the moment to say things that kind of really come from the heart. And I never really know what I'm gonna say until kind of like lights on and we're streaming and we're going. And yeah, I just got an inspiration to kind of to say that. And I was just like, oh, this is pretty meaningful to me right now in this moment. And I didn't script that. I didn't plan to say that. It just felt like it was right to say. And it's something I've been thinking about very deeply. And honestly, I think my inclination at first was to keep that to myself. But it just felt like the right message. So that was just an interesting kind of thing. It's just to like kind of like let that kind of spill out of me a little bit. But and I understand that what it could be like to hear that for audience members and for you as the guest, it could feel a little awkward to have somebody like broach heavy topics. But nonetheless, I do to awkwardly transition to something a little bit more approachable and I would say less what morbid or dark. I'm actually excited to have my audience kind of get to know you better. And I would love to hear from your perspective. How do you recall us meeting via Clubhouse?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I kind of stumbled into one of your rooms once. I can't remember which one it was, but you were bringing up some kind of an interesting discussion about a topic, as you do, usually controversial topics or a variety. But I think the one that we stumbled into was something to do with philosophy. It had to do with different schools of philosophical thought. And I just really appreciated the way that you kind of didn't just like, the discussion was about like whether this particular school of thought, you know, the goods and bads of that school of thought versus other schools. But you kind of like did an amazing job of taking multiple sides to get people to think and to kind of stay in a almost neutral, might not be the right word, but you were very stimulating. So you kind of got people who might be like, well, this is why I think this is a terrible school, or this is a great, you know, kind of thought process. You were very good at like then challenging them. Okay, why and why not? And I thought that was really amazing. And I definitely appreciated your depth of knowledge. So then I kind of connected up, reached out to you, told you what I was working on, which for those of you who don't know, so my name's Scott Mitchell. I am starting to do a lot of content now around how our psychology interacts with the technology we're dealing with. So I call that thought hacking. So that's my name of my podcast. But my primary purpose there is really for us to start to become more self-aware of the way that we think, because we're all very fallible people. And I think one of the challenges that you very eloquently point out often is that we don't realize that we're fallible too. We have that kind of block bias, where we just kind of think that we're the exception to the rule, or we don't have our own biases. And it's natural, right? It serves a function psychologically. You should think highly of yourself. But what happens is then you end up in this place where you're like, oh yeah, look at all those people, whoever they are, and they do that. That's so dumb. I would never do that. Meanwhile, you're doing it in other aspects of your life on a daily basis, and you're just not paying attention. So part of my thought process is, wait a second. First of all, we live in a time, I think, that's very profound. We're in probably one of the most significant transitions in all of human history right now, with the speed of technological change and societal change and the intermixing of ideas around the globe, and the ability for us to do things globally as a species at a level we've never been able to do them. That is, recent. Only the last few hundred years we've been able to do some of the stuff we can do. And if you really break it down, like there's stuff that we couldn't do 10 years ago now that is regular. It's amazing. And I think the next few decades are going to be really profound with the mechanization of intelligence and some of that stuff. So it becomes interesting watching, like, why at a time when you could make the case things are better than they've ever been on average for humans across the planet, on average, not everywhere. It depends on your location, obviously, right? But if you're in that place, why does it feel like we're about to turn into some kind of Armageddon? Why are people becoming more and more polarized? And I started really exploring that and realizing a lot of it's at a core level, it has to do a lot with the way our psychology interacts with technology. So I thought, well, if we're ever going to solve these big problems, whatever they may be, whatever the ones you think are most important are, we have to figure out how do we bring people back from kind of the fringes so that we can have healthy, productive, useful conversations and start to gather the collective attention and resources of humanity towards solving problems, as opposed to kind of like feeling better about certain things or feeling a certain way, and we end up turning on each other, because a lot of that, I think, comes from this desire for humans to feel certainty or to think they understand things. And so when things change rapidly, when we feel overwhelmed, we become anxious, we start to try to seek out certainty. And that plays out, I think, two ways in today's world. One is we end up seeking out information that just confirms what we already think, because it makes us feel safe. So we become more ideological, we become more a little rigid in our thinking, because it gives us a psychological certainty that makes us feel more safe. When things are really dynamic, I think I would argue that it's better to start to try to challenge yourself to think more fluidly, to be more, open, to basically be more flexible in your thinking. But the natural psychological response is to kind of pull back and become more rigid. So I see that happening a lot, and that starts to polarize people. And the second is the social element of that, which the algorithms on social media really foster, which is to find kind of a tribe of people that are like-minded. So that, again, it's like a psychological defense mechanism. So if we can find whatever group, the other flat earthers, the other this political party, or this, whatever it is, cause or idea or identity. And then what ends up happening is you start surrounding yourself with people who already think like you think. You start looking for things that are already supporting what you think, because it's easier and it's safer, and it makes you feel, it fills a psychological need. And I think that actually is one of the greater challenges for all of us, globally today, is how do we get out of that? Because when we're in that place, we can't collaborate. We can't discuss in a healthy manner. It's harder to, at least I shouldn't say can't, but it's harder to. And ultimately, it's harder for us to find ways to, work together, to compromise, to collaborate, to solve these big problems. And I think it's a direct response of the human psyche to the technology and the rapid change that's occurring today. So, yeah, so that's why I started thought hacking. And that's kind of there's a lot of nuanced components to how do we overcome that. But I think it's really important, because there's so many amazing people out there today, and you can connect with people anywhere on the planet like that right now. And yet a lot of people use all this technology just to reinforce what they already think, and kind of maybe become even less flexible in their thinking, which is kind of ironic to me.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up flat earthers, because I've been engaging with flat earth types vis-a-vis Clubhouse for like the last couple of months now. And it started off really as just a kind of passing curiosity, because I had never really interacted with people who were outspoken in their willingness to I guess reject traditional models of the planet, and even the idea that the earth revolves around, rotates around the sun. So the rejection of the heliocentric model. And part of what I was interested in, well, there were several things I was interested in simultaneously. One was like, what is it that makes people cling to beliefs that are, I think, pretty apparently not true? Like what's in it for them psychologically? What motivates that? And then kind of tracking like the logic of it, like what actually are they offering as justification for the belief? And at first my attitude about it was like, it's it's pretty innocuous, I'm just kind of curious. And then my curiosity grew to a kind of fascination, because of the what I would have described as a combination of zealousness, dogmatism, unapologetic ignorance with respect to basic scientific concepts,
Right.
and a kind of moralizing of the perspective, which is what I didn't really expect. And it kind of has this tenor of a religion for them. And there's a whole social factor to it. And but then I began to be preoccupied with what I thought were pretty like readily identifiably fallacious arguments. Like they were intellectual sleights of hand. They were attempts to pretend to be scientific or appear scientific or appear rational or logical when they weren't. And so that actually sparked, so then I went from fascinated to being indignant about it. And then I became preoccupied with combating what I thought was brazen attempts to deceive people,
Mhm.
um, and to take advantage of the fact that, generally speaking, people don't have thorough, in-depth scientific understandings. They understand things at a very basic level.
Mhm.
And so there were particular characters in this group of people who were exploiting an advanced understanding of niche scientific concepts in order to make it seem like their conception of the flat earth or whatever made more sense than the scientists, and often argued as if they were doing science better than scientists. I had never
Mhm.
encountered that particular brand of flat earther, but
Mhm.
when I looked into it, I actually discovered that actually this kind of modern conception of flat earth, this modern flat earth movement, was started by somebody by the name of Samuel Burley Robotham. And actually he used to employ analogous tactics of basically making pseudoscience seem like it was actually legitimate science. And it was
Mhm.
motivated by particular conceptions of readings of the Bible.
Mhm.
Um, and so once I figured out all of that, then I began to understand nuances I didn't begin to understand. But this was after I had become preoccupied by my indignation. And so I kind of made it my mission to kind of like challenge them, just partly for my own amusement, but partly also as an intellectual challenge. Like I wanted to test the depths of my scientific knowledge, because I usually don't engage with scientific
Mhm.
arguments or debates or anything like that often. So it was just kind of something new.
Mhm.
Now I said all that to say this. There was like, looking back at it in retrospect, it started off kind of with the usual kinds of motivations that I have for just kind of like jousting with ideas, comparing and contrasting, deepening your understanding, engaging in a healthy dialectic. That's how it started. And so I really wasn't perturbed all that much by the flat earth types, and I kind of saw them as pretty harmless. But then past a certain point, it became a kind of like pride thing.
Mhm.
And one set of motivations slowly but surely gave way to another set of motivations. And then and the most recent thing, I think a few days ago, I actually had like a long form debate with one of the kind of leaders. He's the one that's the best able to make the arguments seem like they're scientific, but they're not.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and I listened to it, and I remember thinking distinctly, like the way I'm interacting in this context is a lot different from the way I used to interact, which is, it's not really about winning the debate so much as about understanding all points of view. And once I felt like I understood what was going on, I no longer was interested or motivated by that. I was more interested in defeating it, or
Mhm.
exposing the sleight of hand, or exposing how ridiculous it was,
Mhm.
for my amusement and that of people who agreed with me. And so I became guilty of the very thing that I often try to check people on, which is like, it's not so much about ridiculing people who think different from you, and mocking them. It's more about like the habits that are the most germane to the healthy dialectic. And so
Mhm.
to a certain extent, I kind of lost my way with that. Like I kind of got lost in the weird machismo of demonstrating or showing off how smart I am in front of people, as
Mhm.
opposed to, I would say, the genuine gracefully, like, to play like, I think I forgot there was one of the monk debates where somebody said this, but the university manner is what he described. He said the ability to play gracefully with ideas is the kind of thing that the universities are meant to develop in people.
Mhm.
And I've always found that influential. I like that concept. That's the kind of thing that I aspire towards on Clubhouse and elsewhere whenever I'm engaging. um and so now I'm kind of like rethinking my approach, because I don't really need to engage with flat earthers anymore. I feel like I've kind of learned all I need to know, but I've learned a lot about myself though, and that's the thing that I
Mhm.
think is the most valuable. Like I've learned a lot about like gravitational theory and uh atmospheric refraction, and really I was motivated to deepen my understanding of those things to kind of point out how their arguments were flawed.
Mhm.
But I think the biggest thing I've learned is like how easy it is to become embroiled in a kind of uh, polarization, or in a kind of
Mhm.
like us versus them stuff. Like it happens in the political arena a lot,
Right.
and I'm pretty good in general of snuffing that out and trying to minimize that. With some exceptions. I mean, even with respect to some political things, I just think that some things are just like like, nah, we're not gonna pretend like that's a legitimate idea. So I even have
Mhm.
my limits with that, but for the most part, I think I can kind of like engage in good faith on all sides of an issue. But yeah, when it came to something that it struck me as so fundamental and so obviously true, I
Mhm.
kind of lost even my patience with even entertaining that in the spirit
Mhm.
of like good faith engagement, and it just became about mocking people. Um, and so even I fall prey to it, to be honest with you. Like, and that's one of the things I learned about myself. But also, like I'm willing to be honest about it too. Like I don't deny that I did that. And to a certain extent, I feel a little bit of a shame because it's counter to what I ultimately want. But I do think that like man, like it's made me more cautious moving forward. I think. I mean,
Mhm.
even now, I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to re-engage the flat Earth types, because there is something amusing about people arguing about things that I think are silly, but I don't know.
You're bringing up some fascinating points, though. I mean, so for example, I mean, this is clearly an analog or something that's very like this same thing that's happening in the flat Earth space is happening in so many different levels and so many different issues, where people kind of slowly get into this place and then they surround themselves with other people thinking that way, and then it becomes more of it's not so much a logical debate about seeking truth. It's almost like a social cultural place where they feel safe. They're in a group that knows the only truth. Like a lot of conspiracy theorists get into these types of things. But one of the things you kind of brought up through what you just said, which I think is really interesting, is this idea of there are people out there that are genuinely trying to understand the world better or to help others and further their like again their understanding of the world. And then there are those who are absolutely intentionally trying to deceive for their own benefit or gain. And it's funny because when I look at things, I often start from a place of let's assume people are being authentic and genuine. And then I go, oh, wait a second, this is not authentic or genuine like you're talking about. This is intentional and it's deceptive and maybe even hurtful. Then it's a different thing. And there's when you mention this, I mean, I think your own self-awareness is really important and great. And that's a very healthy way to look at things and to call yourself out when you're doing what you're doing. But it also kind of stimulates another concept, which is there's people again who are genuinely trying to seek things to make their lives better, the people around them better, and maybe they're off on some of their whatever it is. Maybe they're inaccurate in their thinking, they're inaccurate in their information, they're whatever it is, right? And so you can have a debate, and if there's like with the flat Earth thing, I think it's nice because there's a lot of things that are very objective that we can pretty much objectively verify. It's not something that's like some esoteric theory. It's like we've been to space and you can basically prove it so many different ways. There's so many different like elements of it. And so it provides a really interesting discussion where it's something that as a species we can fairly as objective as you can get about anything. We can pretty much objectively prove that this is true. And yet there's a subset of people who are like, nope, nope. Not only that, it's been going on for 500 years and millions of people would have been involved in this conspiracy and all this stuff. And it literally gets to this level of like religion. It's not a logical debate for some of these people. But what's fascinating to me about that is there's a difference between the people who are like, oh, I'm curious and I've read some stuff and seen some stuff on YouTube or whatever. And I think this is probably like, I'm not sure. Maybe NASA is lying or whatever. Um, and then there's the people who are like, they're trying to get something out of it, whether it's money or whether it's just attention or whether it's just because they believe it. And they're doing things deceitfully in the information space we're in today. Even something as innocuous as the flat earth thing can actually have profound consequences. It's actually not a harmless kind of conspiracy theory because in order to believe that the world is flat and that all the stuff that we thought we knew is untrue, you basically have to in essence say that all of science is lying to you for over 500 years and that the foundations of society and science and information that we assume to be true are not true at all. They're all lies and they're intentional lies by some whatever entity, the government or some Illuminati, whatever group is for whatever reason. I don't know why it's so important to hide that it's flat, but because of that, then anything else that we now assume to be true or is widely accepted in society becomes fair game. Because if they've been lying about how the earth being round, then why wouldn't they lie about whatever other debate. And so suddenly, like, you don't listen to anyone about anything. There's no credibility to doctors when it comes to vaccines or medicine or anything else. There's no credibility to a physicist talking about physics because they could be part of the whole conspiracy. And so your worldview becomes completely unconnected from things that have been widely established with tremendous amounts of evidence for literally hundreds of years. And that can then be applied across the board to other areas. And I think that it actually can hurt people in terms of their understanding, but it can also hurt people in terms of their ability to say, something doesn't smell right about this idea. Something doesn't sound right. Something's like your BS detector gets turned off a little bit. If you think that basically 400,000 people, that worked for the NASA, moon program when we went to the moon, that either all those people were intentionally lying, or that the smartest people in the world who literally spend their lives studying, rocket science somehow were fooled by people who maybe didn't understand rocket science to believe that we were going to the moon when we weren't. So you either have like all these people that literally were hoodwinked and they didn't know that they weren't really going to the moon, or a huge number of people knew and they just lied about it for some reason. When you believe that, it's very easy to believe all kinds of horrific other things that can be much more impactful. So my point is, at what point do you and I and others have a responsibility to sometimes call these people out? Because if we don't do it, who will? I'm not saying we should. I'm actually openly asking a question here, which is, because if we believe that the future can be better than the past and should be better than the past, I would also argue that in order for that to actually happen, we need a certain percentage of people to be grounded to a certain extent in reality. All of us are fallible and none of us are grounded in reality perfectly. There's all kinds of debates you could have about what that really means. But in a general sense, if we're totally untethered from facts or data, and our worldviews are completely disconnected, how are we going to actually accurately, in a useful way, build a brighter future? And how are we going to protect ourselves from being manipulated from malicious forces, from people with malicious intent, whether it's state actors or non-state actors who have an agenda and are willing to use, our own psychology against us? So at some point, there's a responsibility from someone somewhere to say, wait a second, like, if you're going to spread misinformation intentionally, maybe maliciously, when do those of us who have the ability to say, whoa, let's examine this, when do we get in that conversation? Because if we're not showing up and only one side shows up, a lot of people with good intentions are going to get sucked into these. And again, this is a microcosm for all these other areas of debate in our society. So I don't know. It's an interesting question, because if no one stands up and says, wait a second, that's inaccurate, and here's why, or like, let's explore the logic or the logical fallacy of this. If nobody stands up, then it's very easy for people to just kind of fall into these places. And unfortunately, as I've discovered, like you in your journey through this, is that it's not always just harmless people exploring an idea. There are people with malicious intent or doing it for selfish reasons that know exactly what they're doing, and they're trying to manipulate people in a way that's not good. So yeah, that's my kind of question and thought to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. There's a lot of questions you can kind of break it down into as well. And I think that one of the things I've begun to appreciate in the last few months of reflecting on these kinds of questions is the complexity of it. I think that, for example, one layer of complexity is that there's actually a complexity in terms of like, what is it that actually motivates or leads people astray when it comes to how they formulate beliefs, the kinds of fallacies that they tend to make, the kinds of biases that they're guilty of, and a lot of them are not conscious. And so it's actually not always clear whether a person has malevolent intent or is falling prey to the kinds of misgivings and reasoning and stuff like that.
Very true.
People have very powerful incentives to cherry pick data points that can help validate a conclusion that they really, really want. And a lot of times they'll do that subconsciously. Like, it's not like I'm deliberately ignoring other data, like as a conscious thought process. Like, I want to deliberately ignore other data, and I only want to pick this data because it helps me get to a conclusion. It's more like, what is it that can help prove this thing I really want to be true? Let me
Right.
look. And I'm looking and I'm looking and I'm looking and I'm looking, and I found it, and I found this and I found that and I found this, and all of these things help support my conclusion. Now, in the process of doing that, I was ignoring other things, but it wasn't ignoring it because I recognized them as countervailing evidence. I was ignoring them because that wasn't what I was looking for. I was looking for support. And there's a lot of rationalizations people give. You can say, well, yeah, anybody can say anything on any side of an issue, but I'm looking for the thing that proves me right. That's like a common rationalization. And people don't realize consciously that what they're in effect doing is cherry picking data points.
Right.
They don't realize that at all.
Right. And that's a very human thing to do. It's actually hard for us to not do that. It's actually harder to not do that than it is to do that, because there's an inherent bias to support what you already think. There just is. You know, I actually saw Jeff Bezos is who I saw say this, but I thought this is a really great concept, and it's so true. He said, you know, there's no evolutionary advantage or filter for people seeking out truth. Like there's nothing in our that has basically filtered, you know, through our like there's no genetic pressure to seek out truth. There's a genetic pressure to seek out social connection. And so as a result of that, like people are much more prone to seek out alignment with other people socially than they are to seek out what's true. Because oftentimes things that are true are uncomfortable, or things that are true cause like they require a challenge or a discussion that maybe, again, might be difficult or might challenge someone in a different, higher position than them. And in, you know, certain times in history, that might get you killed, right? Or that might, or that might cause you to be ostracized by a community. If they're one religion and you start challenging that, that might get you literally like kicked out of the community. So there's a lot of natural psychological pressure to fit in and to prioritize social connection over something that is accurate. But if you genuinely are trying to live your best life, or if you're trying to build an organization, or you're trying to whatever, help society or make the world better, it's important to start to be able to decipher things that are accurate from things that are inaccurate. And, you know, obviously, you know, you're a philosophy guy, so you understand. I mean, some things are clearly like they're verifiably true or false. Some things are probably actually true or false, but we can't really tell for sure. We don't necessarily know. And then there's like opinions and a bunch of stuff out there it's not really like a true or false thing. It's just like, this is a perspective or a way of looking at something. And so we have to first be able to just decipher, like, what are the things that matter, especially that are verifiably true or false. And if they're and there's so many things today that in a 30-second fact check, you could figure out and go, oh, that's not true. Or, oh, wow, that's something that really is happening. And one of my things that I try to practice every day, I consume probably about an hour of content a day, whether it's reading books, whether it's reading media, whether it's reading science, because I want to challenge myself to grow. And so to me, that's like working out for my brain. And so I do that very vigorously as often as I can. And I've forced myself to include in that an automatic filter that gets me to fact check things. So almost every day I'll come across something and I'm like, ooh, let me just double check that. And it's kind of like when, you know, like you'll get the phone call from your bank or somebody calling you on the phone and they're like, hey, there's fraud going on. I never go, oh, cool. And then, you know, like they could go, oh, there's fraud going on, but I just need your account number to whatever. Can you verify this? You know, a lot of times those are scam. If they're asking for real information, they're a scam, right? But rather than like worry about if it's a scam or not, I'm like, oh, my bank is calling me or whatever. Cool. I hang up on them. I go, thanks. What's this about? They tell me, then I hang up on them. And then I go out to a source where I can find the actual bank number and call the bank directly. And then I can find out if the bank really was calling me or if it was fraud, right? Because I'm verifying it through another channel. So the same thing happens whether, you know, especially in social media, those are some of the, like, you have to prioritize what's reliable and unreliable. But if I come across something that seems interesting, but I'm just like, I better double check that. Even if it sounds plausible, I go to outside sources intentionally, and very quickly, 95% of the time, you can see like, oh, this is like, there's 4 articles talking about this being a scam, or you know, and they're from credible sources, or there's not much discussion, you know, whatever it is. And pretty quickly you can go, oh, that is true, or that is, or at least a part of it. A lot of times what you find is like part of it's true, but there's kind of a distortion in the stuff you're consuming, or you'll see like, oh, that's absolutely false, like a straight up disinformation thing. And I have literally changed my opinions on things sometimes just by doing fact checking, because it will jolt you into like, oh, wait, maybe my assumption's wrong. And so I don't know. I would encourage people to try to build in, and I know it's hard because we're all busy, but even a little bit, it's just like a practice. Like it's like working a muscle. Like if we don't do that, then we're really subject to it in today's world. And it's gonna get worse with deep fakes and AI, using all kinds of things to distort stuff. We've got to take some responsibility for the information we're consuming and whether or not it's accurate by checking ourselves. And then literally it's 30 seconds or a minute and you can find out if something, anyway, you get the point.
Yeah, I do. And that's another layer of complexity too, as far as like understanding the various dimensions of complexity, is like the world is changing, and the means by which information gets to people and how fast it gets to people, and therefore how fast misinformation can spread, are also parameters that have changed drastically. There's a lot of even complexity about that, and also like there's a literacy component, like media literacy, people having kind of basic skills that are tried and true, or that are reliable for disambiguating between things that are true and things that aren't. I don't take for granted that most people these days know how to do that in unmotivated or fallacious ways. Like I think people are wired in such a way as to fall prey to various forms of misinformation insofar as it comports with things they already want to believe. In general, I think people, if they don't want to believe it, they become really, really good at debunking it. But if they want to believe
Right.
it, then that actually is the thing that they fall prey to. And so people aren't even really consistent with respect to the methods that they know how to employ.
Right.
And so, and a lot, I think people aren't self-aware about their own cognitive dissonance or motivated reasoning or any of those kinds of concepts. And even I fall prey to it too. Like sometimes I'll fall prey to it. I won't be aware in the moment, but I'll be aware after the fact. Usually it's like context where I'm like listening to a recording of a room where I was speaking, and I'm listening to myself speak or give an argument or react to something or respond to something. And then I could better see where I may have missed a step or gone awry or whatever. Or sometimes it'll prompt me to like research something germane to what I'm talking about. Like, wait, is what I'm saying even true? And sometimes I'll find that, hey, the thing I was saying actually wasn't even true.
Yeah, I've done that too. You're like, oh, whoops, like I was doing the thing that but that's the point. You're fallible, so you're willing to check that, and you're willing to change when you realize that. And that's hard to do.
Actually, I have a concrete example that just came to my mind. This is actually in the context of the flat Earth thing. So I was going back and forth on one of those voice chats. They have the new voice chat thing on Clubhouse, and somebody was talking about the sun, and I think their point had something to do with. Well, I think my challenge to them was like, what if the sun is local in the atmosphere? That's like a thing that flat earthers argue. Like, what is it made out of? Like it'd have to be made out of something different from what we think it is. And
the correct answer is a giant LED screen.
Yeah, but like he used the term what did he use? He used the term plasma. And I at that point was unaware that the sun technically is considered a plasma, and what that meant scientifically. I had heard it described. Well, but I had heard the surface of it. But I had heard that I had heard what I vaguely remembered was some association between the concept of plasma and the sun. But I thought it was an analogy, like it's like a plasma, but it's not literally a plasma. And I think I issued that I corrected him in that way, and something like that. But he was like, no, actually, the sun is a plasma, and his whole thing was like, well, there's experiments where they've made plasma float, ionized gas basically float using magnets and stuff, and that was supposed to be like a pathway to saying, oh, well, then the sun could be made out of plasma and it could be floating. That's ultimately what he was trying to argue. But I was saying like, I don't think that that's right. I think that my whole point was that plasma is ambiguous because plasma can mean a lot of things. We can talk about blood plasma, things like that. But that was an incomplete understanding of the concept of plasma as it is applied to ionized gas, like what that is on the surface of the sun. So when he sent the link that I looked at from NASA, and then I read it, and then I had a better understanding of what he meant and how scientists actually do use that term the way he used it. So I was like, oh, okay, so he's actually right about that part. And so that was something that I actually learned. And it was like, at first I was kind of like not willing to acknowledge it, but I was like, actually, I'm willing to acknowledge it at this point, because, like, first of all, it's just true, and I got it wrong. But secondly, it ultimately doesn't help his point anyway. So it was like easier, but like that hesitation in the first place, and it was motivated by a lot of the same psychological stuff that motivates other people. Pride, not wanting to let them win. When you view them as like standing on the wrong side of the issue,
right.
All of that same stuff was like, and I listened to it again recently, and I was like, I don't know that I ever told him that I was wrong. I just kind of moved on, and I think that I owe that. Like, there's something important about, like, when you get it wrong, like, you need to like be as loud about it as you were willing to be loud in your wrongness. Otherwise, you're just kind of like not taking responsibility in a way. And sometimes it's hard because the people will weaponize your admission against you in a way that's not really fair. It's like, I'm trying to do the right thing, and then they'll kind of take that as, go, see, he's wrong about this, he's probably wrong about all the other stuff too. Or they'll blow it up or whatever and make it seem like you're not trustworthy or credible. But it's like, that's not really fair. I had one simple mistake. Like, if you were going to be good faith about it, you could just like own up, like, yeah, he owned up to it. Okay, we can move on, that kind of thing. I think that'd be a better attitude. But
well, I mean, I think if you just look at that from like, yeah, sure, people can try to play these games with it and use it against you, but at the end of the day, if you're doing something in good faith and with integrity and character, and like trying to actually like admitting you're fallible and trying to, like, these are the best scientists too. Like, not everybody in science does that. Not everybody is capable of self-reflection like that. But if you are, I do think there's an element of that where over time it shows. Like, there's some people who are like, oh yeah, see, you gotcha. But I think a lot of other people go, oh wait, look, this is a guy who's genuinely seeking this, as opposed to people who are just always like, I'm my way or the highway. I'm the only, I know the only truth, and a lot of those arguments eventually devolve into something akin to like a religion, in the sense that they're like almost faith-based. Like, you have to like pass a litmus test to be on this team, and you have to be pure to the team and the ideology of whatever team it is. And I don't think that's helpful for advancing the quality of life for humans, or making the world a better place, or for us as individuals living a better life. I think it's literally simply wanting to feel a certain way psychologically. So a lot of what we do as humans is try to placate our psychology in a way that soothes us, that makes us feel okay, that makes us. And I've had some really good discussions with some friends of mine too that are amazing people, and they'll get into a particular cause, whatever it is, and they'll be really passionate about it, and we'll start discussing what they're doing or whatever, and it'll become clearly apparent that without them realizing it, they're not really trying to actually affect change or cause transformation along the lines of that cause. They're in that because it makes them feel like they're doing something. It makes them feel okay. And that becomes the real question. Like, is in a lot of cases, do you just want to feel differently? Do you want to feel like you're part of the solution? Or do you actually want to help? Do you actually want to affect change? And they're not the same thing. And so these are just things we have to start to become aware of, because, I mean, like, at the end of the day, we are leaving an imprint. Like, what we do leaves an imprint. And if again, there's no guarantee that the future is brighter than the past. The only way that happens is if enough of us step up and say, hey, let's work together to help each other become more accurate, to help each other make better decisions, to help each other take actions that move us forward. But oftentimes it's our psychology that gets in the way of that. It's our psychology because we want to feel a certain way, or because a lot of times the actions are or the desire to change, like internally, it becomes kind of uncomfortable. It's icky. It's like, oh, and one of the things I think is important, by the way, when people are, say someone's a flat earther and they're deep into it and they start to get like, this isn't adding up. Like, it can happen where people start to kind of like break away from that. If we don't give people permission to like save face, if we're like, well, I told you were wrong. And this happens a lot more in like politics and heated debates. We want people to come back and like grovel and be like, oh yeah, I was wrong about this. The problem is then there's a psychological pressure, even when they start to realize that they're not being accurate, to not change, to not become open to things that are more accurate, because then they feel like they personally, their personal identity is being attacked. They were wrong. They made a mistake. They're dumb. They're whatever. And they start telling themselves these stories. So then they cannot admit that they're wrong. And so again, we have to first realize that so much of being human is psychology, and so much of our consumption of information and our distribution of information and the way that we choose to act or not act is literally about placating or, dealing with our own psychology. Like, does it make us feel good or bad psychologically? It's going to be really hard for us to make, as a society and individually, better choices, and then ultimately take better actions so that we can build that better future. Because again, we have more power as a species than we've ever had in human history. And that's going to continue, at least for the short term, to accelerate. But how we use that is going to determine whether we end up in some weird dystopia, whether we destroy ourselves, whether we end up in a much brighter, more amazing future. And there's a lot of reason for optimism, and there's a lot of reason for pessimism. But I think first and foremost, we have to become more aware of our psychology internally and externally with other people, because how you communicate to people, if you're not taking their psychology into consideration, how are you going to have any kind of meaningful discussion? Because they're just going to shut you down, because they're going to feel personally attacked when you're trying to have, a discussion about logic or a discussion about an issue or whatever. And yeah, you get where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, and even that, there's complexity with that too. But yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot. It's hard to know exactly what people's psychological states are,
right?
Other than what they kind of make explicit either in their behavior.
And you don't ever need to assume, and you never should, in my personal opinion, ever should assume the state of someone else psychologically. But when you're communicating, you can take into account the possible states so that you can give them a chance to not feel psychologically threatened. Because if they feel psychologically threatened, there's no way you're having any kind of logical discussion.
No, I agree with that. But I guess what I was going to broach is, like, because you don't know, you're kind of playing a kind of probabilistic guessing game. And sometimes certain people will kind of make certain things clear just from their behavior or nuances of their engagement, but sometimes not necessarily. And so that's a layer of complexity that you have to navigate. But also, what you also don't know is it's not just about their psychological state, but it's also about like what they know and don't know. Right. And like that's also hard to navigate too, because when you're having discussions that require certain kinds of familiarity, say like with the legal system, or how certain facets of our government work, or certain niche scientific concepts like atmospheric refraction, or whatever the subject matter requires knowledge of, there's a lot of people, particularly in on Clubhouse, who will just assert an opinion with a blatant disregard for the nuances and the details. And sometimes it's like, if you're trying to be attentive to those nuances, even if you're not even taking a position, you just want to like make sure that those nuances are accounted for in their perspective. A lot of times they'll resist you just because their perspective doesn't require attentiveness to that nuance. And in some sense, maybe attentiveness to that nuance might potentially contradict their perspective. So they'll just be hostile to it. So one example of this is, we were talking about the recent resignation of Claudine Gay, who was the former president of Harvard, and she's in the news. And there was somebody who gave a pretty stern perspective. There were people who were pointing out that they felt that it was racially motivated. She's the first Black woman to be president of Harvard, and the kinds of people who are kind of doing the most and leveraging the most power were many of them were white conservative GOP types. And so there was this implication that that kind of lends credence to this narrative. And some people were pointing out that, well, objectively though, if a person, as she has, as Claudine Gay is alleged to have done, committed like 50 plus separate instances of plagiarism across 11 different publications, and also was not very well published, like there's something about that objectively you can be like, yeah, based on that, she probably isn't qualified to be president of one of the most prestigious universities in the world. So there's an objectivity there that was a nuance that needed to be taken into account. And then the response to that was from a person who basically his whole rebuttal was, all of you in this room who are saying all of these things about academic integrity and how that's supposed to come with the job of being president of Harvard, none of you guys authentically or genuinely really care about plagiarism anyway. So you guys don't even understand the different nuanced distinctions between types of plagiarism, and there's levels of egregiousness that come with them. Therefore, you're being disingenuous. And that struck me as an odd thing to reply. So
Mhm.
in the spirit of what I normally do, I was just kind of I wanted to like challenge that, but it wasn't challenging it in the sense that I'm saying everything you say is wrong. It was just like, well, I don't think that's being properly attentive to the points that you're responding to. So like I'll just ask you directly, if hypothetically a person committed 57 acts of plagiarism across 11 publications, do you think that they're qualified to be president of Harvard?
Mhm.
To which he didn't really answer directly. He kind of started dodging and giving one of those kind of roundabout gish gallop answers that don't really answer. And so I went, well, I mean, yeah, you said a lot of these other things, but I was just asking you this direct question. And then I started falling prey to my own emotions in this point, because I don't like what I perceive to be deceptive and evasive
Mhm.
modes of engagement. Like if I'm an interlocutor, I want to be Socratic. And there's an expectation that if I'm asking you Socratically something, you're going to answer in good faith and answer honestly, even if it contradicts something you said before. You're not going to hide
Mhm.
that fact, because if you start doing that, then you're not playing fair. And then I get indignant about that. And that manifested myself in, at some point in this, trying to get him to answer the basic question and me just getting frustrated. And then I lost my composure entirely. And I started calling him names. And I was saying like I kept saying snide things, like the stupid thing that you said XYZ, which actually undermined what I originally intended to do. But
Right.
because I got frustrated that I felt like he was being weaselly, and I actually did use that term to describe what I thought he was doing. I just felt like, dude, like straight up, like how can you, like at first he wouldn't answer it, then he finally at some point answered it. He goes, I asked him the same question again. If somebody hypothetically committed that much plagiarism, would they be worthy of Harvard? And then he goes, he said something to the effect of, well, no, not really. Meaning, like,
Mhm.
it's totally fine
Right.
if they do that and they could be. And I went, what? Okay, so then justify that. Like, give the reason. Why is the person who commits plagiarism worthy of being president of Harvard? And then he did the dodging thing again, which
Mhm.
then I met with even more name calling and other stuff that I'm not proud of, but I did do it. And then at one point, I finally got him to give a reason. His reason was, well, other people who have occupied that position or similar positions, either at Harvard or elsewhere, have likely done worse things, which
Mhm.
to me was ridiculous. Like I was just like, that's not a good reason. Like
Well,
that
yeah, this is
means,
a common one though, right? I mean,
yeah, but
yeah.
to me, and then I'll finish here because I want to get your opinion on this. Just the basic logic of it was weird, because it was just like the moral reasoning is basically, if other people have done worse things, then I get to do a bad thing that's not as bad. That's the
Mhm.
basic reasoning. And I was just like, that doesn't jive with like our considered judgments about these things at all. We wouldn't just approve of bad things that I do because other people similarly situated have done worse things. Like, so I get to rob you at
Mhm.
knife point because other people have robbed other people at gunpoint, and
Right.
that's worse. Like I can give you example after example after example of the
Right.
application of this logic where I don't think you would approve of that, but it's like it was annoying because it's like, why go down that road? Like I feel like you know better, and I feel like you know why that's ridiculous. And then he tried to bolster. He was like, well, yeah, do you know that some people who are former presidents of Harvard own slaves? And I went, I don't think that has anything
Yeah.
to do with what we're talking about, but I'll acknowledge that that's worse. I think owning slaves is
Right.
objectively worse than
Right.
plagiarizing 57 times in the paper. I'll give you
Right.
that, but that doesn't justify her academic dishonesty. That doesn't justify that. Like that's not a justification. So it was just it got heated because I lost my composure, and
Right. Yeah.
also because of what he did. But like I own my part in that. But that's a good example of like, even when I attempted to hold myself to a higher standard, I let my, I think, understandable indignation at the mode of engagement, which I felt was in some sense dishonest,
Mhm.
get the best of me. And then I think it undermined the force of what I was trying to convey, which is I was really just trying to point out like there's something invalid about what you're doing. And now that I'm calm and collected, I can do it a lot better. But in the moment, I was so indignant about it that it was just like, I'm upset now. I'm visibly mad about it because I can't believe that you're doing this right now.
Right.
And then it became this weird machismo thing. So I want to get your thoughts on that, because that actually happened either yesterday or the day before. And it was recent. I want to say 2 days ago it happened.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different components to this. I mean, I think first of all, it's really important to understand that like none of us are perfect, and so when you're going through your day, like I have this kind of concept of like if we have like a center line, which is like you being your ideal self, we're always getting knocked off that, and most of the time, in fact, you could argue we're not fully on our center line, right? We're like bouncing around over here. And then you will remember, oh, that's not who I really am. Like, you know, you have those moments in life, you look in the mirror and you're like, I did that? Like, what? That's not me. You know, all of us have that. And so the point is like all the time, you're going to get knocked off who you really are and you're going to make mistakes. But the thing that's kind of cool in my perspective about life is that really quickly like that, you can start to remember who you are and kind of come back to your best self, right? So the fact that you are fallible or the fact that you're going to go down a path and like call somebody names or whatever, that's okay. The thing that life is about is learning to recognize that more often or more early and then come back to who you really are, because it doesn't, like I always say in my podcast, like you don't have to be perfect to contribute. And the more we try to pretend that we are, it's silly. Like your job is to try to be the best you can be. And when you get knocked off that, or when you choose to get off that, just remember that and come back, because it's like you can take a deep breath, and in one deep breath, you can go, wait a second, that was out of line. I was off center, whatever. Now let me come back to this and let's do something more productive. Along those lines, I think it's important to realize too, like all of the stuff we're talking about, at the end of the day, all of us are humans who don't really know what the heck's going on. We think we do sometimes, but there's so much more that we don't know than what we do know. And so at the end of the day, like those of us who are genuinely trying to be our best, which I think most people for the most part are, but I think it's a matter of self-awareness in terms of how deep and nuanced you can get into this. But it's like, if you want to make the world better, if you want to help people around you to enjoy life more, if you want to live life more richly and deeply, like you talked about at the beginning of the show, where you start to become more aware of gratitude and that sacred urgency of the present moment you're in, then like that's the real like fulcrum and leverage of where life is and where the power of life is. And so if we start at that place, like how do I try to be the best me I can be in this moment? And then from that, how do I also interact with people in a way that spreads, you know, healthier perspectives, or spreads, more importantly, like just improved psychological thinking or logical thinking or other things, so that collectively as a group, we can shift that arc of history toward things that are better for all of us. Because none of us are going to, like, there's more stuff we can't control than we can control. We control very little bit of life. And if we can start to remember that and start to play in that space, and when we're in that space, just remember, like, hey, if we got knocked off who we are, come back. But at the end of the day, like, have that compassion and empathy for others, no matter where they are in their belief system, no matter how, you know, like off kilter, because you're off kilter too, right? But it's that point of like, can we, like, in a little way, subtle way, move people back toward a place that's healthier, where they can have better collaboration, where we can move people towards solving problems, as opposed to, like, you know, focusing only on the problems, or focusing only on, oh, this group did this, like this victim mentality. A lot of us, it's, again, that's a psychological way that we, it's a natural thing that all of us do to some extent. Like, we other people, we're like, well, that group, oh man, I'm glad I'm not in that group because they're a bunch of idiots, right? And but I'm in the right group. Or like, I don't do that, I'm not in that group. That's totally normal. Like, we have to realize that and go, oh, it's not good, but we do it too. So like, have compassion for people who are in that place, and then try to move them back to the center. And so, not, I'm saying center in like a perspective sense, but I'm saying like toward a place that's healthier, where they can have a better discussion. And one of the red flags that you brought up in this discussion is this idea of, like, people will bring up this like whataboutism, or like this kind of idea where they're like, hey, like the one I've been hearing a lot lately from some people is like, you know, you're like, well, there's some things that I don't think are healthy for democracy, like gerrymandering or whatever. And they'll be like, well, yeah, but we're not in a democracy. You think we're in a democracy? Ha, that's ridiculous. We're not in a democracy. This isn't a real democracy. And you're like, well, first of all, why do you think that? And then they'll start telling you their reasoning. But here's the point. Like, in order to accept that idea, then if someone says we're not, it's the same exact thing you were just saying. If we're not in a democracy, it doesn't mean we shouldn't, let's pretend that we aren't. I think we are, but let's pretend that we aren't. It doesn't mean that you should then just be like, therefore we don't need to be democratic at all. Like it's like what you're saying, like, well, this person did something bad, so therefore it's okay, like you said, to pull a knife on somebody because somebody else pulled a gun on somebody. Once you look at the assumption that's required for that thing to matter, like, so if we could get into the discussion of democracy and what it is and what we are and all this stuff and how perfect we are and not perfect we are. But if you're saying we're not in a democracy and you're using that to justify like undemocratic things, then at some level, the assumption that the statement you're actually making is that some people's voices or votes matter more than others. And that's the actual heart of that statement, is like, well, so you believe, even if we've not been perfect in the past, what you're saying is it's okay that some people's voices matter more than others. And I'm going to assume in this discussion that you think you're one of the people's voices who should matter more than other people's voices, whoever the other group is. And obviously, if we believe in a general idea of the current like system you and I live in, like, that's a ridiculous idea that somebody's voice. Now, does it happen? Yes. There are people with a lot of money that might have a bigger say. There are people with more privilege that might have a bigger say, whatever. But it's the concept fundamentally doesn't hold water when you say, like, we think intentionally and justifiably that, that you should matter more than someone else. Like, that's not a healthy way to run a democracy, right? And so that becomes the point, is like, whenever, that's just an example, right? But what I'm trying to say is, whenever you see this idea that someone says, well, this is an absolute and therefore it justifies all this other stuff. Like, well, there are people who steal money all the time. There's greedy rich people that do this, so I should do this, that should be a red flag. Because if we want to create a world that is, and I'm not saying I'm perfect at this either, but if we want to create a world that's better than the world we live in now, then we can't just say, well, other people do it, so I should do it too, right? Or like, these people do it worse than me, so therefore I should do it. Like, we have to try, and I'm not saying we're perfect. You get what I'm saying, though?
Yeah, I get it. And I agree. I guess the main thing is that I was offering an example to kind of explore the nuances of that
nuance is critical, by the way. I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, and it's tough. Like, I guess part of it is like, even when you advocate for certain modes of engagement, like, the same things that get the best of other people can get the best of you. So there's a humanizing
100%.
factor to it. I think that's one of the things that I actually kind of learned about the flat earth types, is like, even though the particular thing that they're advancing, which is that the earth is flat and is stationary apparently, which means it doesn't move,
except all the other things we observe do. So it's weird,
right? But even like the ridiculousness of that aside, like, the people who were advancing that or defending that, it became pretty apparent to me that they're falling prey to a lot of the same things that I fall prey to in other areas and other domains with respect to other discussions. So there was a humanizing element there. Like, I was able to recognize pretty quickly, like, there's a commonality in our propensity towards, fallibility in various different respects in our intellectual exchange, what we understand, what we know, the interplay with the education system, and how that plays with that as well, because that impacts in a major way what people know and don't know, what people understand and don't understand about things. And it was interesting how there was also this dynamic of them being primed for certain kinds of manipulation, because the way that they think lended itself well to certain kinds or styles of argumentation, evoking, if not explicitly, like, implied or in a tacit way, implications having to do with, well, this information comes from this or that institution, and this or that institution is not trustworthy because they're in on it. Like that, there was a lot of that kind of reasoning going on.
Well, in flat earth, almost everyone has to be on that, which is part of the whole process. That's why I say it's actually a very destructive worldview, because if everybody's in on it, then there's nobody you can trust that is in any kind of authority position.
But also there was a lot of like hypocritical cherry picking of things that certain scientists had said and offering that as evidence. So it was weird. It was like, well, if they're members of the institution too, then why are you only trust them when they say the things that you think help your argument, but you don't trust them otherwise? Why is it that certain pictures from outer space that you think make I don't know, the idea that there's such a thing as outer space look dubious, or it looks like it's a fake photo, like, you'll submit that as evidence, but like the the hours and hours of high definition footage from low Earth orbit from the ISS, like that's all fake and green screen, all of it without evidence. Just like this is no, it's all fake. It's all fake. It's like, but like, why do you get to make those moves? And like it was just example after example of that kind of thing, and it became pretty clear to me like the depths and complexity of deception that make the lie seem sensible. Like I just kept enumerating all of these examples, and then that revealed how primed these people were to believe that kind of stuff. Like that was weird that was or I should say that was a bizarre thing to learn or deepen my understanding about.
But it becomes a really interesting question, right? Because like you and me we try to be aware that we are fallible too. We can get sucked into stuff too, but we're actively trying not to. We're actively trying to fact check, to call ourselves out, to explore. But then it becomes a question of like, well, are most people, are we the exception? I don't ever try to put myself in that kind of category, because I think that's also another way of misleading yourself, is thinking that you're the exception to the rule. But at the same time, like there are a lot of people who easily fall into these things. And I think it's harder for someone like you or I to do that. But we have to be really careful there, because then again, it's like we are absolutely able to as well. But and so here's a couple things. One is, I think, to be in the camp where you're trying actively to make sure that the information you consume is accurate, that automatically will give you a heads up over some people who are just like, they're just reinforcing what you already think. And so I think that's the first thing, is realizing like when you think something already, even if you're right, just make sure that you consume information that disagrees with the things you think on a regular basis, to challenge yourself, to make yourself stronger. Worst case, if you're correct, it's going to make your understanding of why you're correct better. And best, like another side of it is, if you are incorrect, you might realize like, oh, and a lot of times it's in the nuance, like we've been talking about. And I think another red flag or thing to be aware of is like this kind of cartoonization. Whenever our brain, so again, our psychology, we want to simplify things into these easily understandable bites. That's why we like memes so much, right? But it's this idea that like you take a group of people or a concept and you just make it into some kind of goofy cartoon. It's like black and white, and there's zero nuance. It's like all people that are this are this. Oh, they're this, then they work for a drug company, then they must be this. They must not care about your health. They're just in it for profit, or what. I'm just giving random examples, but like the point is, like, people are super complex. Ideas, a lot of these important ideas are also highly complex. And if you don't understand that there's nuance, and you don't try to seek out the more nuanced understanding, like if you're like, there's, in politics, people love to do this. They'll call it a name, like the Inflation Reduction Act or the crime, whatever this is, and that's great. But like most people don't think that inflation should be higher. Most people don't think that we should, have, like rich people just control everything and screw poor people, right? Most people want things to be, reasonably fair or equitable in society. But when you look at an idea, there's usually reason why people can be on both sides in at least a normal discussion. But it's that cartoonization where it's like, well, they can't because they're this, or like it's just black and white. Like, don't you care about this? Or they're trying to do this. And you see this all the time. And so whenever you get caught cartoonizing things, or you see other people doing that, this should be a red flag, because there's always nuance and complexity, and people are not all one thing or another usually. Like, and a whole group of people sure as heck isn't all one thing or another. So like, you're like, all Democrats are this, or all Republicans are this, or all, even all flat earthers are this, or all whatever. Scientists are all this, doctors are all this. It's never like that. It's not how it works. So anyway.
Yeah, no, and I agree wholeheartedly. Another way to put that same idea or similar idea is that people that comprise any kind of group are not a monolith. There's complexity within the groups.
And also, I would argue too, a lot of the most profound concepts, the most profound value comes in the nuance. It comes in the details. It's not in the, like, if everything was super broad and easy to define, then like most people would probably agree, but in real life, so many things, there's a lot of complexity to the different sides. And it's, if you don't try to explore and have curiosity about the nuance, you're not going to get anywhere that's really deep, or you're going to miss out on some of the more interesting components of something, of a discussion. And that's, it's kind of lazy thinking, and it's kind of a shame. It's natural though, because our brains actually, I think, desire to be energy efficient. Like they're designed to minimize calorie use to some extent. So like they're going to take shortcuts. It's like the way they're designed, not for negative or malicious intent. It's just because it's easier. And if we can
Right.
make, like if you can more quickly identify the lion trying to attack you, that's better, because maybe you're really hungry and tired that day and you don't want to be like thinking about the nuance of what kind of lion is it? Is it a male lion or female lion, and how big is it? And like,
Right.
but in real modern life, it's different.
Yeah. No, I agree. And like a lot of times I go back and forth between like what is the most effective way to interact with certain kinds of engagement. If I feel like I'm getting somebody who's not
Mm.
engaging in good faith and is being deceptive or conniving and manipulative, what exactly do I owe that person? And to what extent does that look different from my mode of engagement with a more genuine interlocutor? And I actually don't know what the answer to that is. It's actually hard. Like a lot of times, because I'm indignant by the deception or whatever, or the disingenuousness, I justify things that I come to regret later. But I do think that there's something to be said about changing your tact with people like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think among other things that I think are probably fair game are naming the deception, naming the disingenuous tactics, naming the mistaken reasoning. I think those are fair. A lot of times on top of that, I want to get the person to acknowledge it though. And that usually becomes contentious in a way that probably isn't, the most ideal. And then also often because I'm the mod in my room, I have the liberty or the ability to remove people from the stage. And I will leverage that too. Like when I feel like people are being like dodgy and disingenuous, I will put them in the audience, and then I will name, like, the reason why I did that is because I don't have any desire to go back and forth with the person who's going to be disingenuous. Like,
Right.
here's the thing that like you did in our exchange that is disingenuous. Here's why it's disingenuous in no uncertain terms. That's why I'm putting you in the audience. And then a lot of times I'll give them the ability to even come back up as long as, but I have a caveat. It's like, don't do the thing I just named again.
Yeah.
And like now you can actually like answer my question directly or whatever. That's one of the things that I do. And maybe there's room to critique that, to be fair. I don't even know that that's like 100% on the up and up, but there's something about like the accountability that I'm aiming for, even though I'm not executing it perfectly. And that part I think is right. But on top of all of that, I often end up insulting people. I call them dumb and stupid and stuff like that, mostly just because I'm really upset with them.
Right.
And I think that those are the things I would even criticize. Like, yeah, that probably isn't the most ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a work in progress. Like, I'm not perfect, but I really like when I'm at my best and I'm the most patient, I'm actually very conscientiously not insulting with people. I'll just be like, okay, here's the thing I think you're doing, and I don't think you have to do that. Can you not do that? Like can we, you know what I mean? Like, can we just talk straightforwardly, or can you not do this thing? And then if they continue to do it, it's like, okay, I no longer want to engage with you because you keep doing the thing I asked you not to do. So I'm put you in the audience, and then I'll move on. And then when I do it that way, I'm really even keeled. I'm not like yelling and screaming at people. There's no need to be vulgar or curse. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Right.
But man, I can't tell you, it really drives me up a wall when I feel people are genuinely, because it's offensive to me. It feels like it's an insult to my intelligence. Like, it's almost as if you think that I don't know that's what you're doing. Like if somebody tries to pull one over on you, even if they're not successful, there's something anger inducing about it on average. It's like, you thought of me as the kind of person that would fall for this trick, or that would, allow you to bamboozle me in some way. And that that means that it implies you think low of me or my intelligence or my ability to be keen on that kind of stuff. And that's offensive to me. I really don't like it. You
There's
tried
a
to take
really
advantage.
interesting point here, I think, that's worth considering, is that what you're saying, everything you're saying, I think is valid and true. And like, it's normal to feel that way. But when you start feeling that way, you could create a little check inside yourself that says you're kind of making it about you without knowing it, or without intention, because yes, maybe this person is doing that because of you, but maybe they're just stuck in their own psychology. Maybe they don't genuinely believe it, or maybe they're just trying to whatever. But what I'm getting at there is there's an opportunity to like, and I'm not always good at this, by the way, but there's an opportunity to practice this art where you're like, hey, yes, this offends me, but it's not about me. It's about either one of two things. A, is this person, in the cases we're talking about here, they're not, but is this person someone who's genuinely seeking out like growth and learning, or are they just trying to like either force their opinion on others or disingenuously like support an idea? And then the most important part becomes like, especially in your situations, there's other people in that audience. And when your whole idea is about like improving discussion and creating opportunity for people to learn and grow and think, if someone is being disingenuous and they're doing something that's offensive to the or unhelpful to the audience, let's just say, then it's completely appropriate to move them, out of the stage, or to directly call out where they're doing things that are disingenuous. But if you take your own ego, your own part of this out of the equation, it's easier not to get upset. Because I find this and this is just me talking for something, but I found this a lot in myself. I realized that there's certain things that like, they really bother me because I'm like, that's a matter of principle, man. You can't, like, a company will do something and they'll like suddenly like kind of try to screw you a little bit about some dumb little thing. And I'll just get really, really frustrated and I'll like fight tooth and nail against it because I'm like, this is a matter of principle. And there are things in life that really are matters of principle that you should stand up for. But a lot of times it's easy to get caught up in the emotion of that. And then it's like, why? Like, yes, I don't agree with what just happened. But when you make it a matter of principle, it becomes, at that point, it becomes this like almost part of your identity, and you're like ready for a fight, and I think sometimes in those opportunities, there's an opportunity for us to become, again, more centered, more self-aware, and go, wait a second, like, is it really about me? Is it really intentional or whatnot? And like, really shifting the gear to what's the outcome. Like, if you're in a clubhouse room and your outcome is like, I want to create the most useful, thoughtful, arena of ideas for the people participating in this as possible, then it becomes like, okay, is this helping or hurting that? If it's hurting that, is there a lesson I can use? Like, can I do something with this to serve the audience? If I get upset because I take it personally, for example, does that hurt, my ability to support the audience? Am I taking away, do they lose faith in me? Do they lose faith in, so you start thinking more about the outcome broadly. Now I'm just talking a little bit here, so I don't mean to go on a little tangent, but basically I think I do this a lot too, so I recognize it. And it's just this, we get our own ego caught in the discussion.
Yeah.
And we tend, like, a lot of our overreaction or really like anger or defensive reactions come because it's a personal slight on our own ego, our own identity. And if we can get past that, then we can more objectively like get the outcome we want, which is what's best for the audience, without getting the anger or the emotion, because we're not taking it personally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think part of my soul searching is like, why do certain things, why do I take certain things personally in the first place?
Yeah, I struggle with that too. It's a good question.
Yeah, and I don't know that I've answered it or thoroughly or whatever, but there's something about the idea of people taking me for a fool.
Yeah,
that is really deeply offensive. I don't consider myself to be a fool. I consider myself to be a pretty sharp person. So for somebody to behave, but for somebody to behave in the context of a conversation as though they take me for one is deeply offensive. And one of the ways I express that idea is like, or you might say stereotypically, do you take me for a fool, or like, do you think I'm stupid? Like you
or do you
are
think the audience is stupid too? Because sometimes it's not even just you. It's like,
yeah, well, but if I'm taking it personally, then I'm not really concerned with the audience's impression of me per se. I'm more concerned with like that person treating me as though I'm stupid or I'm not keen on what they're doing.
Right.
I genuinely find that offensive. And so there's something about that is the source of it. But then there's also the other thing that's equally as powerful for me is like the idea of cheating. Like, to be deceptive or disingenuous to me is a form of cheating. You are breaking rules of fair, good faith engagement when you do things like that. And so you're not playing this game fair. Like, if we are competing in some way because we're debating or we're disagreeing, right? You can't afford yourself a bunch of benefits that you won't afford me. Like there's usually this dynamic of like you're doing that thing, but if I did it, you'd object. Like, so why are you doing that to me? Like, that's not fair. And I have no desire to do that thing to you because I want to play fair. And so like the cheating element is also anger inducing for me. I don't like cheaters either.
Right.
Because they take advantage or give themselves unfair advantages in the context of, you know, a back and forth exchange. So there's a sportsmanship element, so to speak, that I think is violated when people behave this way. And I think that like it cheapens any validity that they may have had to their argument, because a lot of times, even when people argue in this way, some of what they're saying is valid and it deserves to be recognized as such, at least the parts that are valid. But like they're undermining in many cases the most valid parts of what they're saying because they're cheating, because they're engaging in bad faith. And that's also a tragedy, particularly when it's a nuanced issue and parts of what they're saying are valid. And they're claiming to represent typically groups of people who are negatively impacted in some way. They're cheapening the moral force of what they're saying when they engage that way. So that dynamics also cause for indignation for me as well, because it's like, if you're gonna be, you know, arguing on behalf of, say, the Palestinian people, we have the debate that's going on in the Middle East, right? And if you're gonna argue on behalf of them, there's a lot of validity to the recognizing the dignity and the humanity of those people and the extent to which the things have been done in the context of how the Israeli government, you know, treats them or whatever, that where they have legitimate grievances. The legitimacy of their grievances should be recognized. But if you're going to argue for that in such a way as to play up or exaggerate what the Israeli government has done or the role that Zionists play in that, and you're going to make them tantamount to terrorists in their own right and use hyperbolic speech like that, you're to whatever extent that's false, you're undermining the moral force of what you're saying entirely. And you're drawing attention away from the validity to the parts that are like not good faith about what you're saying. And I think that that's tragic, because these people deserve to be represented better to whatever extent that they have legitimate grievances. And I see this kind of thing actually with respect to many contexts of many different discussions implicating many different populations of people, where the spirit of what's being argued is in the right direction, but the actual arguments are not valid or not just or are fallacious. And it's like, that's such a tragedy, because those are the people you're pretending to care about. Often I take for granted they're pretending, but even if they genuinely care about them, but they're just bad at arguing, the people that you're advocating for, your advocacy is being undermined because you're going about it wrong. And like, that's really what frustrates me with people who kind of take on this mantle of like, I'm going to defend the defenseless. It's like, well, there's a way you need to do it where you maintain the moral force of whatever's valid about your side, and you don't give that up with disingenuous arguments where you just you play games with words.
Well, I got this from you actually, and I still use this a lot now. I really like this, but you were talking about this idea of steel manning, and the reason I like that concept so much is that you're actually trying to help strengthen the manner in which the argument of your, you know, whoever's discussing something with you, if they disagree with you, because at the end of the day, a lot of people are just not good at debating, or they're not good at, but they might have an idea that's valuable. And if you try to give them the benefit of the doubt and you try to actually enhance their argument so that you're, you know, like you point out to me, you're taking your best case argument against their best case argument, it's a much more interesting discussion than if you're like, you know, taking your best case argument that you're, you know, good at discussing and debating against someone who's just like, they're just not skilled at debate, or they're just not knowledgeable or whatever. So there's real value, I think, in that. But again, I think what you're getting at again is this idea of these people are disingenuous. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes they could be disingenuous or come across that way just because, again, they're passionate and they don't really know how to discuss things because they're not used to doing it. So I try to start with the idea of giving people the benefit of that, which you do as well, by the way. I know that. But I think it's complicated, because I think if someone is truly being disingenuous and they're not adding value to the discussion, they're hurting the discussion. Like, this is one of the classic debates about the, social media today and stuff. If people are putting out intentional disinformation that's harming people, do we just say, well, it's free speech, let's let them be on these platforms? Or do we say they're putting out intentional disinformation in a way that they're either getting personal gain at the expense of others, or that is just harming others, period? Is there a line where that's not acceptable? Because if it's harming people, then, and it's truly like, verifiably, inaccurate, then there maybe needs to be a line. The same for your audience. If someone's coming in, but I think that the interesting thing that we're talking about here, where there's an opportunity for growth, it sounds to me like, is, and I have to do this too, this is something I need to work on too, is not taking it personally. I get in certain situations where I get defensive because I feel like, again, same thing, like someone's calling me out and I haven't fully formulated or completed my idea to them. And then they start like saying things in a way that I feel are accusatory. I'll start getting really defensive because I'll take it personally. I'm like, again, like same as you, like, are you calling me an idiot? Or are you like, are you attacking me as if I don't know what I'm talking about? And that's my ego. Like, that has nothing to do with, like, the better way to do it is to get out of that spot and say, wait, what's really happening here? Like, if it's just one-on-one, do I even need to be engaged in this conversation? Is there any value? Am I learning anything? Am I contributing anything to the other person? If not, maybe we should move on because we're all busy, right? In a clubhouse room, you got people listening. Is this somehow supporting the argument? Like, I would just throw this out there. When you do these rooms, because you do a lot of amazing rooms, what's the purpose of the rooms? Why do you do what you do on Clubhouse?
I have a lot of purposes simultaneously. One of them is to explore ideas, particularly when it comes to controversial topics and issues, because a lot of times they're really complex. But they're often understood as simple when they're not really simple. And so it's an opportunity to dig into the complexities, elaborate, elucidate, educate. I mean, I'm an educator, so part of it is there's an educational value, because it's an opportunity for me to learn, but it's also an opportunity for people who are listening to learn too, and to learn from each other. Even when we're engaging somewhat antagonistically, you can learn a lot from people who disagree with you, because they are primed and motivated to bring to bear things that support their position. And to whatever extent that those things are true, you have to grapple with them. If you're going to engage in good faith, at least you have to grapple with them. So, like, if I have an opinion that depends on, something not being the case, but then somebody who disagrees with me presents a lot of compelling evidence that the thing that I thought was not the case, in fact, is the case. I gotta, like, if I'm gonna take that seriously, I have to contend with, like, okay, wait. If the key premise in my argument is false, then what impact does that have on my position? Right? I got to lay to bear. Okay, wait. And in order to do that, I got to track what the other person's even saying. And then I maybe fact check. Okay. Oh, actually, not only is this evidence and this evidence that they presented pretty compelling, but here's some other evidence that they didn't even present that I found on my own that actually makes an even stronger case. They didn't even put that in there. So now I'm building. And that's what Steel Manning, I think, does, is like it primes you to be receptive to the opposite side of an issue if you're going to take one position. Or if you're like me, I often don't really take positions so much as track positions. So I know that there are opposing positions. Here's the strongest case for that position. Here's the strongest case for the other position. Now, how do they mesh with each other? Now, that's where the fun is to me, because I get a thrill out of keeping track of all of that complexity. And then I think if you do this right, you start building complex positions, because your positions are now the product of you taking into account a lot of information, and it's not clear how it all fits together. Sometimes it seems paradoxical. It's like, how can this be true, but also this be true at the same time? Oh, my bad, I messed with my mic. And so it's not really. And so one concrete example of this, I did a room recently. I've been doing several rooms actually on this. We were talking about what's going on with Donald Trump and the removal from ballots. And so Colorado was the first state, according to the Supreme Court, to remove Trump from the ballot. And then Maine had a decision from an election official to remove Trump from the ballot after a hearing. But now Trump's challenging both of those. The Colorado State Supreme Court decision is being challenged to the Supreme Court, and then the Maine decision is being challenged in Maine state courts. And we were talking, and we were elucidating all the complexities of that. And there's actually a lot of complexity legally, questions about process and due process, and to what is owed to Donald Trump. Questions regarding whether or not Trump engaged in an insurrection. What is the definition of an insurrection? What definition did the actual district court in Colorado use? And is that a sensible definition? Why or why not? Like elucidating those complexities was actually really informative.
Yeah.
And then reading the majority opinion and have them lay out in very straightforward and very, I think, approachable terms. I appreciated how accessible the decisions are. They're written in pretty plain language where you just basic reading comprehension, you can understand a lot. Now they're going to use some legal jargon, and you can look up that stuff, and luckily we had some people in the room who are familiar with it, and they were more than happy to elucidate, what is jurisprudence mean? What does de jure mean? Whatever legal jargon, like they're like, okay, well that means this, right? Self-executing is a concept that's actually up for debate in the context of that. What does it mean for something to be self-executing? So we were just elucidating. And what I began to do is I began to track the complexity of both sides of this argument. You have the people who are totally on board with keeping Trump off the ballot. You have people who are totally not. And every time one side felt like, no, our case is like insurmountable and unassailable, I think is the term. It's like, well, actually, here's this nuance that I don't think you guys are tracking, and actually it gives credence to the other side. Grapple with that. And then this side start to get strong. And it's like, well, okay, now we got them back. It's like, well, actually, here's the two things that they said before, but then they didn't consider that actually there's this third implication, and now their thing is stronger. And so it became this kind of like, and in the interest of the discussion, I was really motivated to continue this, but it helped that I genuinely didn't have a side. I didn't have any emotional investment in making sure one side won. And so it enabled me to do what I did well. But I don't know that I could have done it as well if I was married to one particular position.
Right. But what you did, I think that's so profound. It's really a valuable takeaway, I think, for everybody, including myself too, is just always like we don't have time to delve into every single issue in depth in real life. Like that's not how life works. But if there's things that you genuinely care about or that you're interested or curious about, like actually read the source material, go to these things. What's so crazy about technology today is you can literally go to the actual stuff like that. It doesn't even take that long. And so much of what we're fed informationally is spoon-fed to us by someone with an opinion about it or whatever. And so they'll, with intentionally or not, they'll cherry pick things, or they'll use straw man arguments, or they'll do whatever. And we're not even getting the actual stuff. Like you just talked, you read the actual decision. How many people that are interested in that topic have read the decision? And it's not that hard to do, like you said. Now, we can't do that with everything, but my thing to anyone listening to this would be, if there's stuff that you're genuinely curious about, that you think is important, that you want to, be involved with to make the world better or whatever, actually read the source material, actually find out what's really going on and get into the nuance, because it'll, at worst case, it'll strengthen your argument, right? And I say in worst case, because if another possible thing is you turn out, hey, wait a second, maybe my argument wasn't very good, and you end up changing. If you're trying to seek out what's true, you can, and again, in your case, like you're being neutral. There's a lot of things like that where it's such an opportunity to learn and grow. And so, picking which things you have the time to do that with is obviously a challenge. But I think when we do care about something, we should actually do that. We shouldn't just listen to what some pundit that we like said, or just some, a friend of ours said. Like it's not hard in today's world, if you actually want to seek out things that are accurate, to go to the source material, to go to the actual set, what someone said, and listen to it within context, as opposed to like the 10-second soundbite that's being, taken out of context and put out there. And all it's going to do is make you more informed. So I think that's awesome. I think that's great.
Yeah. So to give you a taste of this is I pulled it up just for kicks.
Yeah.
This is the actual Supreme Court decision. And if you can't tell, it's 213 pages. And so
I'm not saying everyone should read all of that, but again, reading through some of it's valuable if you actually care about this.
right. And you could pick out certain things to concentrate on, which is what we ended up doing. But what was interesting was like the I ended up doing 3 rooms on this, and the first one, I think the first rule we concentrated on trying to summarize what the majority opinion was and why they thought what they thought. And I read a lot of the stuff. I read the introduction material, the procedural history, because those are relatively short things to read. And I was, but the analysis is really long, and I was trying to like not bore the room. And we were able to kind of come to some consensus, but people came to the room with their own biases. Now, I wasn't in the best position to check anybody's bias because I just didn't know enough. And the more that I grapple with it and read what I read, the more I was able to kind of play referee. And so I thought I felt I needed to do more rooms because I needed to compensate for being a little too one-sided in the previous rooms on certain issues, because there were people who came and they had better familiarity with the law than other people. And so their perspective kind of won the day because I wasn't in the best position to steelman the opposition. But once I started reading the dissenting opinions thoroughly, then it was a lot easier to give the other case. And it was, and I had some understanding that there was a good case to be made on both sides, because the Supreme Court, the Colorado State Supreme Court, was split 4-3. So it wasn't like it was a unanimous decision. And other courts in other states had thrown or dismissed the case for similar reasons that were articulated in the dissenting opinions. And it wasn't until the third room where I actually thoroughly read through the second dissenting opinion that gave the most nuance about something that I had read at a high level. I read the summary, but I didn't get into the nuances, and I was curious what the nuances were. So I read the analysis more thoroughly. And it was so scathing of an analysis that it was just like, wow, this is actually a really robust analysis for the other side. And until that point, everybody felt kind of confident, like, oh, like the decision is airtight. Like there's nothing you could say. They found, that Trump committed insurrection. They had their definitions, all that. And then I read it, and the short of it is, just to summarize, the second dissenting opinion basically said elucidated the extent to which the election code procedures are very specific about how much time is supposed to be elapsed in terms of adjudicating election qualification questions, and how the District Court of Colorado literally altered all of the deadlines. The deadlines are actually explicitly named. You have 2 days to do X, Y, and Z, 5 days to do X, Y, Z, another 5 days to do something. The whole process is supposed to take like 12 days. In fact, the way that they did it, they kind of freestyled it, and the entire process took like 65 days or something like that, like way off. And the justice that was writing the dissenting opinion was elaborating on the extent to which the election code does not permit that kind of thing, yet the majority is arguing that the code was written in such a way as to accommodate answering questions of the complexity of the sort of whether or not Donald Trump engaged in insurrection, given all of the facts that they found. But if they were able to do it in the time that the actual election code specifies, then why didn't they do it in that amount of time? Which was details I didn't have. He also elaborated on the kinds of legal options that Trump's team would have had it had been litigated at the federal level under the federal, whatever the relevant federal code was. And Trump would have been able to subpoena witnesses. He would have had way more time to prepare their arguments and opening statements and closing statements. They would have had more time for testifying and stuff like that. There would have been a bunch of different options that they would have had that they didn't have. And so that actually implicated the question of whether or not they actually got adequate due process. To deprive them partially of due process is to undermine the spirit of what due process is owed. So like it was a compelling argument that nobody was focusing on, because most of the people who were in my room happened to be of the opinion that Trump deserved what he got. And I wasn't able to that third room to actually like give the, and then once I read it, then a lot of people who were super gung-ho were like, okay, yeah, actually that's pretty compelling. I gotta deal with that. And I was proud of that one accomplishment because and I may not change their minds ultimately, but it was just like now you have to grapple with the nuances in a way that other clubhouse rooms probably you never would have even come to terms with it because most people are not going to read that. Like I read it because I'm a nerd and I'm motivated because I like to learn, but most people like to just comment in complete abject ignorance of things, and they're totally content doing it. And then it's like as long as they don't know they're ignorant, they're totally fine with it. So it's like, well, and sometimes I do that too, to be fair. Like I don't know everything, and sometimes I'm pretty confident in my opinion, and then I a certain opinion pretty confidently. And then I find out some other information, and it was like, oh my God, if I didn't know that, I wouldn't have said what I said, because like now I got to think about these other things. So I fall prey to it too, but it sticks out when it's other people. When you know the stuff they don't know, it sticks out to you. It's a lot easier to recognize when it's other people. It's one of those things like bad breath. It's like when everybody else has it, you can recognize a lot easier, but when you have it, you're the only one that doesn't know. That kind of thing. But yeah, so what do you think about? I know I spoke a while, but what do you think about any of that?
No, I think that's really interesting. I think one of the things that's really fascinating to me that stands out about that whole concept is also like it depends on what the question is that you're discussing. Because if you're discussing the legality of the Colorado case, that's a different question than someone might argue. Well, they think that it's unfair if this person that a bunch of people want to be elected is taken off a ballot, then they can't vote for that person. And they want that to happen. That might be a very different question than legally did he violate the 13th Amendment or 14th Amendment, right? Yeah, 14th Amendment. And should be removed from the ballot. So like I think this is an important part of discussions too, is that the question that's asked can determine the discussion. And, this is a lot of parsing that happens in the legal world where it's like a very specific niche thing, and what you're talking about is like, well, there are people that have opinions about things relating to this that are based on a different question, which is like, should or shouldn't, people have the right to vote for this person or whatever. That might be a very different question than legally does this person have the right to be on the ballot, or that might be a different question than like you were, like some of the due process question, like does someone have to be like convicted of insurrection before they can be removed versus, whatever. And so like there's in different states, there's been a lot of, from what I understand, very different reasons why cases went forward or not because of how they were argued and what the questions they were addressing were. Sometimes I think that's actually very apparent in legal stuff, is that when, again, this is a great place for nuance, because you'll see stuff on the news or somewhere, you'll read a headline and it's like, this happened. And it's like, oh my gosh, that sounds awful. But then you read what actually was decided. And it was like, well, that's not what they actually said. What they actually said, whoever they were, was that this specific question, hadn't been met or whatever. And the burden of proof on that question is the issue, not this broader question. So, and you see the same thing. And again, I'm talking broad sense here, but like you see the same thing, like scientific headlines, like the headlines and the articles that are written, they'll take things out of context and just blow them up. Like you'll find something about nuclear fusion and then you read about it, or like that. There's just a lot of interesting stuff like that comes out. And the first glance, you're like, wow, that's fascinating. We're about to enter this new world of energy and all this. But then you read the article and it's like this, they made this one incremental step that's really important, but it's super incremental and it's not anywhere near going to unleash all this stuff. But it's easier sensational wise to put out the sensation of like, oh my gosh, we're on the verge of this thing. And so, being able to determine like this little nuance here. And so I think, but legal stuff, I talked to a bunch of lawyers about that specific question because I was curious, and their answers were very different than in a lot of ways what I expected. And I thought they were quite interesting because they're lawyers and they're not looking at, broader philosophical questions or anything. They're looking at the nuance of the law and this like a specific question within the law. And a lot of times, again, it's a specific question within the actual case. It's not the whole case. It's not even like, people will assume, well, like if an appeals court, for example, says that they're going to take on an appeal, it doesn't mean that they think the person was innocent and wrongly found guilty. It might be that they're like, well, we need to examine if this one part of the process in this legal case was done properly. And that's what they're really deciding. They're not re-examining whether the person was guilty or not. And if you don't pay attention to those things, I think, like you said, you miss the nuance and you miss the actual like value of what's happening. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we got about 15 more minutes before I think it'd be good to wrap up. But I think one of the things that I wanted to get your thoughts about
Yeah.
as we start heading towards wrapping up is like if you had to summarize in the form of giving people like some tips or some
Mhm.
tricks for managing not just their emotions but managing different kind of facets of their own psychology to advance a healthy dialectic and to promote in the social context, the wider social context, healthier discourse, what would be some things that you would tick off or check off on that list?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would kind of separate into two different categories. I mean, first, I would start with yourself, with understanding yourself and becoming more self-aware. And the first step to doing that is becoming aware of the questions that you ask yourself and start to shift those questions into more useful questions. So, a quick example would be like, something goes wrong or you do something you don't, that you're not proud of, and you're like, "What's wrong with me?" And that's an example of not a very positive question, but it's a question a lot of us ask of ourselves on a regular basis. A better question, might be to stop that and say, "Wait, well, what could I have done better in this situation?" That's an example, but that's not a great question. So to go into a higher level when it comes to questions, you could get more into like, what would the person I want to become do in this particular situation? Like, if I was the person I really want to become, how would I handle that? And the reason is when you do that, you put an assumption into the question, and your brain doesn't really judge the assumption. It answers the question as if the assumption was true. So basically, you're like prompt engineering your own mind. So we talk about prompt engineering and AI a lot. I think we need to become better at prompt engineering our own minds, because the way we ask the questions determines the kind of response we get. And so first and foremost, asking yourself better questions will put you in a better state of mind to not only better appreciate your own worldview and what's true and what's not true, and improving your accuracy and your actions and like how you deal with all the stuff that's happening, the way you feel about the stuff that's happening, but also then it puts you in a state where you can connect with other people. So one is the questions internally. Two, I would say, is the stories you tell yourself, is a similar kind of thing. But we tend to tell ourselves stories like money is evil, or or like women are this, or this is like whatever. There's so many different ways that I am this. Our identity is a story. The world works like this. Like we're all the victims of these people doing this. And if you're, like a conspiracy theorist, you might be like, well, the Illuminati does this. But the point is, these stories, they have an impact on how we perceive the world. And so checking your stories and going, wait, is that a useful story or not? Because we can apply different stories in different circumstances, and we're just not aware we're applying the story. And so becoming aware of the story you're telling yourself, and then just saying like, first of all, is that really true, or is that just something that makes me feel a certain way? Usually it's something that makes you feel a certain way. Could be true, could not be true, but usually it's like a meaning that we're giving to something. It's not necessarily factually. This is an example of like, it's not verifiably factually accurate or not. It's more like it's an interpretation of something that makes us feel a certain way, and we've incorporated it into our identity or our worldview. So becoming aware of those stories and then finding a ways to make them a little bit more useful, because it's like the world happens to you is in a story that it's not that useful, because it's like, well, maybe it's true. Maybe you're just a random ball of chemical equation, like working its way through the universe, and all this stuff's happening, and it's just all random, and that's fine. But if you say life happens for you, it may not be factually true. It's just an idea. It's just a story, but that story might be more useful, because then you might look at like, well, if this happened to me, what's the lesson in there? What's the value that I can take away from that? As opposed to like, you're just a rudderless ship getting battered. So stories are not necessarily factually accurate or not. They're more about what's useful or not. So I would become aware of those stories and start to craft stories that are more useful, even if you're not sure if they're factually accurate or not. That's not the point. The point is to get you in the right mindset to get the best quality life or make the best decisions you can. And then another quick part of that is I would also practice the art of shifting perspectives. So we tend to run in perspectives automatically because it's what we already think. And so by shifting the dynamic that we're looking at things with, we can start to see different angles. And it can sometimes be useful and sometimes not, but just practicing that, it's like practicing working out your back or a part of your body in a gym or something. You're training your body to do this, and it makes it more easy to shift perspectives in the future. So, you might look at something and in one context, it makes sense. But if you shift it to the context of time, something that's true today might not be true 10 years from now for you or whatever. something that's true, you know, from a big picture 50,000 foot view might not be true at the microscopic level, right? So when you're zooming in on a topic at the nuance, it might be very different than like the big picture philosophical questions. So starting to just try to see things, intentionally putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. Like why would that person, even if you totally disagree with them, why would that person think something like that? You know, like what could possibly, just trying that thought experiment. So that can be really useful. The fourth thing in terms of that would do to kind of put yourself in the right mindset to have better discussions is actually get curious about like the foundational principles of different subjects, like science, like just understanding a little bit more, because a lot of us were not that well trained in these things, and it's actually fascinating. But the more, if you don't have to get super nuanced, you don't have to be like an expert in, you know, vaccines or whatever. But if you can understand just the mechanisms with which like the scientific method works, like how do we do, what is a double blind study, or how do we do, the more you get scientifically literate or literate in law or whatever, just on a basic level, in a very short amount of time, even a half an hour, you can get literate enough to start to immediately pick up on things that don't quite add up, to be like, so you'll be more aware of disinformation if you can just basically understand some of the foundational principles of like for example, medical research. Like how does that actually work? Like how does the university systems like versus the private companies versus, you can read about that for 30 minutes and have just a really rough understanding, but that understanding can give you a little bit better ability to start to see when someone is kind of like saying something that might not be accurate. Like all these universities teamed up to do one thing to try to con you into, it becomes like when you start realizing like how all these people are competing and doing stuff, it becomes more difficult to believe that, because all these completely independent institutions with different motives and different money sources and different other things, who are all competing for like, you know, an advantage, are somehow all perfectly aligned for the sole purpose of deceiving you. Like that starts to become less likely, right? It's not, you know, that's the other point. And then in terms of the outside part, other people, right? When you're, you know, connecting with other people, I think that you first have to realize like, why are you doing this? Because a lot of people do this because they either want to feel validation, like they're right, so they're doing it to prove to themselves they're right, or they're doing it because they want to convince other people because they know that they're right and they're the only way. Some people do it because they're curious, like you do. You go out there and you're like, well, why? You know, like, why do these people think that way? So you're trying to learn and improve your own understanding. And then it can also be like, hey, I want to listen and learn, but also maybe persuade if it's valuable to the other person. So what I'm saying there is first start to understand, like, are you doing it because you're curious? Or you're doing it because you know you're right and you're trying to force somebody to your side of things. And then when you do talk to people, I would start always with genuine curiosity, like you do. I would also start with compassion and understanding, and know like, there's not a place of judgment. It should be a place of like, you know, understanding why this person thinks this way. And is there something you can learn from that first? And then as you go through that, like try to give them the benefit of the doubt. And like you say, sometimes you'll find out that they're doing things deceptively. But if you're talking to a friend or family member who's in a very different perspective on something that you're really passionate about, instead of being like, I'm going to tell you why you're wrong, start with like, why, like learn, listen, try to understand. That'll put you in a better place. And it'll also allow you to create rapport, which is the other part of it. It's just like developing that ability to have connection with these people in a way that's genuine. Because if you're both in this, like, I know the truth and you don't, discussions can't really happen. If you're both in places of high emotion, discussions really can't happen. You know, I have a background in sales, and one of the things you learn in sales is that the job of a salesperson is not to like force people to think something they don't want to think. It's to break down the barriers to communication so you can have a one-to-one human conversation. And if you can get past all the like things people put up to protect themselves, so you can now have a real genuine conversation, then there's an opportunity for someone to say yes, or an opportunity for someone to be persuaded. But if you can't get past all those things, you'll never have an actual conversation where there's a chance for there to be any kind of meaningful transformation or change, or, you know, an exchange of ideas. So I think that's a lot of what it comes down to. I don't want to get too long-winded, but those are some of the basics I would focus on is, and understand, again, it's so important. And we talk about this all the time, Jason, is like, you are fallible. You are not perfect, and you're not supposed to be.
Yeah.
The reason you're doing all this, hopefully, is because you want to live the best life you can live. You want to have the deepest connections with other people you can have. And ultimately, together, you want to be part of making the world a little bit better than it is in the future for your kids and grandkids, or for all of, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's like, that's the goal. How do we live genuine, authentic, like real lives that fulfill us and make us feel great and happy and proud? And how do we help other people do that? And if we're thinking like that, I think that's going to go a long way toward helping us to become better and just enjoy life more, and also ultimately, help each other grow, as opposed to like accidentally turning each other on each other. Because a lot of times I think it's accidental. It's not even like we're intentionally doing that, but we could be part of the problem. That's something we have to realize. Like, we all are to some extent part of the problem, but sometimes we're like right in the middle of it and we don't know it. We think that we're like the solution and we're actually the problem. And so we need to start becoming aware of that.
Well said. So one of the things that I do to kind of wrap up a long, great show is I ask 2 questions. And these are going to be scale questions. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you had an amazing time, and 1 being you had a horrible time. How was your experience being on my podcast today?
Oh, I always enjoy hanging out with you. I'd say 9 or 10. Like, I always have fun with you, man. It's always good. I'm always learning, and it's always a good time.
And then on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very likely, 1 being not likely at all, how likely are you to come back and be a guest on the Black Muse podcast?
Well, because I already know you and everything, I would always be willing to come back on your show, man. I think you and I collaborate well and we have good discussions, and yeah, anytime you want me back on your show. So same 9 or 10.
Awesome. Just for everybody else, I want to give everybody opportunity to look at my link tree. You can find me on the podcast on all social media, basically, that exists. Also, you can find the actual podcast episodes wherever podcasts are streaming. Anchor did this thing where they changed to like Spotify for podcasters. So it's no longer Anchor, but whatever. You can find me on Spotify. You can find me on YouTube. You can find the podcast pretty much anywhere. What is it? Apple Podcasts, all of that stuff. Did you have any links or social media tags or anything like that you wanted to promote right now?
Yeah, I think if you want to check out what I'm doing, you can go to thoughthacking.com. You can go to my YouTube channel, which is under Thought Hacking. You might want to use my name for now. So Thought Hacking Scott Mitchell, or Thought Hacking in general. And then I'm on all the podcast platforms under Thought Hacking. So, Google, Spotify, Apple. And then also I do have a TikTok channel that I use too as well. So there's multiple places to connect up. Yeah, and I plan to.
Is that how you spell it? That I have on there, thoughthacking.com.
What's that?
Is that how you spell it? What I have on?
Yeah, just thoughthacking.com. Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yep. And they'll usually have like the latest episodes on there. YouTube, I'm going to be doing. So I just started like you doing visual podcasts too now. So up until now, they've been audio only. And now I've got a bunch of video ones coming out. So they'll be on YouTube as well. So if you like the video versions, you can go there. And connect up, because I think you and I share the same goal. I mean, I just want to work together with people who want to make the world better and learn from each other, sharpen each other, because that's what it's about. None of us really know what the heck we're doing. We're all trying to learn. And if we do that in a way that's genuine and authentic and, empathetic and compassionate, and we're genuinely trying to make the world a better place, I think we will. And I think if we, keep getting caught in our carnal psychology and our emotions, it's very easy for us to just become part of the problem without trying to be. And, I think, again, we're at a profound time. How you show up and how I show up matters.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I mean, again, thank you for being a guest on the show. It's a great way to kick off 2024 for sure.
Yeah.
And it was a good motivation for me to actually start creating more episodes again. I got a lot of episodes to edit though from 2023, but I'm gonna try to knock that out and get them going before I return back to work. But thank you so much. And then what I'll ask you to do is hang back off the air, and then I'll prompt you for next steps afterwards after I close.
Sounds good.
Sounds good, man. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. That has been another episode of the Black Muse podcast. Let me get my theme music going. You know how I do. It's been another episode of the Black Muse podcast. I'm your host, Jason Muse, aka the Black Muse. Welcome to 2024. Got big things in store this year. I'm gonna try to be a little bit more consistent with the content. Thank you and enjoy. I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. Thank you all for your patience as I continue to make more content. Life gets tough sometimes, but you know what, man? As I said at the top of the episode, I really appreciate it to still be living life. and I'm going to try to live my life to the absolute fullest. And I hope that you do the same. Take care to everybody. And until next time, peace.